Star Wars Hunters is dead. This game could have been a monster, instead another failure. We'll talk about all that and more in today's video. Well, this is disappointing, but the confusing, long, and ultimately failed saga of Star Wars Hunters now is coming to an end. It was announced today that Star Wars Hunters will be ceasing operations in October of this year, meaning that having launched worldwide last June, Hunters only got a year of updates, with the final content drop being in April before the game becomes unplayable on April 1st. This is really disappointing. Star Wars Hunters, as we'll discuss, was really a mess from the start, but the actual product ended up being, in my opinion, a lot of fun. So I would describe Star Wars Hunters as a free-to-play third-person arena shooter. If you've played Marvel Rivals, that's a decent comparison point, and to me, Rivals is also a really good beacon of what this game should have looked like, especially in how the launch was handled. It's kind of funny, actually. Star Wars Hunters was in development in various forms of soft launch for so long that the game format left popularity, then re-entered again, which gave them actually a really unique chance to be successful. So, as a bit of history, we first learned in 2018 that Disney would be working with Zynga to create a Star Wars mobile game. At the time, there wasn't a lot of excitement about this. Zynga has a relatively poor reputation, I'd say, and is connected in public sentiment more with games like Farmville or Words with Friends, or even worse, exploitive mobile experiences. That's certainly how I saw it, and this was when I was starting YouTube. I was starting to go to some of the Battlefront events, and we heard a lot about Star Wars Rivals. I had the distinct impression that the game was never going to launch. I saw a few games, including a third-person cover shooter game, a game very much like Star Wars Commander, all which never saw the light of day. There were also other experiences which launched, but not in a meaningful way despite being good games, and the best example of that, I think, is LEGO Star Wars Battles, which was actually really well fleshed out. It had great gameplay, it was a lot like Force Arena, but closer to Clash Royale, and I saw a lot in Star Wars Hunters that I also saw in LEGO Star Wars Battles. That game ended up having several soft launches in certain territories, India and New Zealand if I remember correctly, but it was never launched worldwide and in fact was actually shuttered. That story had an interesting ending where Apple Arcade picked it up and they launched the game without any sort of microtransactions in a decent state, although without any future content. I thought that was the best we might get for Star Wars Hunters because that game got delay after delay. Gameplay footage was shown in 2021 and it actually soft launched in a few countries in beta then, but it got delayed to 2022, then 2023, before it was announced that the game, to the shock of many, including myself, would actually get an official launch in 2024. And it launched and surprisingly was actually a really enjoyable experience. We played it on my gaming channel X2 a few times, our group, and it was really fun, especially with a full team. But the news now that it's failing, it's not a surprise, and it comes back not just to what I talked about with the messed up launch, but really everything about how this game was presented and put in front of people. When it comes to the launch, however, I do want to mention that I think gaming companies are learning that live service games really only have one shot to capture public attention, and if that fails, the game fails with it. Multiversus was an excellent example of this, a game which I think had pretty good mechanics. I certainly enjoyed it and had an interesting roster of characters, but just fell out of the public consciousness. The same thing was true with Halo Infinite. The gameplay was solid, there wasn't any content. When the content was added, people had moved on to different games. You need to launch a game alongside a strong marketing push if you want a player base large enough to sustain the cost of making new content and running the servers. And there's an element of risk there, like we saw LEGO Star Wars Battles. I guess they weren't confident that they could justify all of the marketing expenses, so the game never left beta. There's probably a way you can do some form of testing before a full launch, but 3 years of soft launching in certain territories is not the move whatsoever. The other issue is the more you delay the launch of a game, the more out of date your original idea gets. As I said, Star Wars Hunters benefited from a change of winds somewhat, but look at Marvel Rivals. They had short, closed betas before a full launch where you're really honestly playing on FOMO. Everyone is talking about this game now. Get in on it. You'll lose players, but hopefully you keep enough to sustain a large base. I just think there's too much competition, and I think another good example of a game going down this path is Valve's Deadlock, which has shed a ton of players. So the timing was messy, but there was an even bigger issue with the launch. Star Wars Hunters was built for mobile devices and to a lesser extent the Nintendo Switch. I believe that this is because when they started development of the game, exclusive console and PC game rights still belong to EA as a part of that horrific deal that Lucasfilm signed. So Zynga was only able to make a game if it was primarily mobile focused, and that's also why a lot of the games we've seen launched have been on mobile. The problem is, while sometimes PC games can work on mobile, for example, I don't know if it still does, but Fortnite at one point had a big mobile scene. Well, it can go that way. It's hard to go the other way for a game designed for mobile to play really well on PC and consoles. That's because when you're optimizing for mobile, you're necessarily going to simplify the gameplay, the controls, and for a competitive shooter like Star Wars Hunters could and should have been, the game loses a lot of its staying power. You compare that to Marvel Rivals, which I'm not saying doesn't have issues. I don't play it a ton, but I understand some of the characters are just not well balanced right now. The game nonetheless is quite complex with a big skill gap available. Anytime you're designing a game for a touchscreen, it's going to be tough to get that experience. And I do think that more than anything is what killed Star Wars Hunters. And I do think that Disney and Lucasfilm could have had a massive hit on their hands. It should be noted that they were planning on launching the game on PC. There was a Steam wishlist page, which has now been taken down. It's hard to say whether the cancellation is due to the tests going poorly. I think probably it's just the game being in such a bad state, and a PC version developed at this point would have had the same core issues as the actual game, given that it was developed for mobile. But back on the potential and the Rivals comparison. Marvel may be a big brand and bigger than Star Wars right now, but Star Wars still holds a lot of public interest, and I do think a good live service game with a heavily competitive aspect and even a mobile launch alongside could have done bananas. From there, you can get a competitive scene and tournament play set up, and you're ensuring your game has a long life, which for Star Wars would be nice. All we're getting is single-player experiences, which I do really appreciate, but I'd like something that I can play between launches as well. Marvel Rivals released last year in December and has, as the time I'm recording this, a random Friday afternoon, 150,000 people playing with a 24-hour peak of 215. It looks like after that point, things are starting to stabilize and the game could have a relatively long life. Star Wars would love to have that. It's good to have people talking about Star Wars. It's good to have a popular Star Wars project like The Mandalorian coming out provided a boon for everything Star Wars. Unfortunately, I don't think Hunters was ever going to be that game, partially because Zynga wasn't the right developer, partially because of that awful EA contract which really handcuffed Star Wars developers. And I don't know, I'm tired of the Star Wars gaming scene taking a loss. Like games like Outcast, which are fine in my opinion, but not great, maybe even not even good, aren't so painful when we're getting no launches. And I look at the history of Star Wars games which could have been really successful, which just weren't for whatever reason. I've talked about this a million times on the channel, but Force Arena, such a good game. I actually started this YouTube channel talking about Force Arena. Those videos are gone. I wonder if any of you were around for that. I had like 100 subscribers maybe. But that game released in the era of big mobile Clash Royale style games and still failed because Disney was unwilling to put the money into it, or was unwilling to find a developer who would fully support it. It's funny, right before the game actually got shuttered, they reached out to me to do a paid sponsor and I was more than happy to do it. But right now, all we have making money is Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, which I've been really harsh on in the past, more so than I should be, having played the game more now, but it still ultimately is just an absolute wallet squeezer. Anyway, disappointing news. Those are my thoughts, though. Let me know yours down below. If you played Star Wars Hunters, did you like it? Which hero did you main? And are you going to miss the game if you were a regular player? Also, will you move now to Marvel Rivals? Will you move on to some sort of other arena shooter, maybe like an Overwatch? Let me know. Talk to you guys later.